have an indicator. Is it running? Dave, is it running?
Yes, sir.
Good. All right. I may divide this class into two for fun and also because you guys are so interested in Veracity. And where's Max? Max is my Veracity guy, but everybody seems to be very interested in Veracity, and this is a super complex topic, especially the Old Testament. New Testament is pretty cut and dried, in my opinion, very easy to go through, but the Old Testament gets complicated, and we're focusing on the Torah, but also, well, we'll get into it. I've got slides like this. This is Death by PowerPoint. I thought that'd be a new, fun way to do things, because I prepared this for another class. This is lecture 2 in another class that I've taught before. But in it, I have a lot of information and a lot of information. And the information I give you here is just a tiny bit of it. It's, I think, very useful information for anyone studying the Bible in terms of history and literature. And also, there is more information I think that you'd like to see, and I'll show you, if we get to those slides, then I'll show you that too. But the most important thing I want to start with is, number one, this stuff, the Old Testament and the Torah. The Old Testament and the Torah. The Old Testament, the earliest documents are written about 1500 BC. 1500 BC. The earliest documents are written 432. How do we know 432? That's the Babylonian return, and that's Malachi. So we can pinpoint this. This we can't pinpoint quite as well. The problem is, and I'm not going to go any huge depth with this. I could in some other class, but the most important thing I would look at and use for it historically. And by the way, if anyone has ever read my book Egypt, in Egypt I really delve into this in a fictional book very historically, because when was the children of Israel's actual exodus out of Egypt? Nobody knows exactly the date. It's very hard to determine. In Egypt, I give a lot of proof that it was probably just before Tutankhamun. There's really good evidence for that historically. What had happened? Does anyone know what happened? Historically, they're not teaching us Western Civ, and this is huge Western Civ stuff. What happened with Tutankhamun? Anybody know?
Is he the guy that won one?
Yeah, he was huge, and in my book, Egypt, I go into great deal about this, because Tutankhamun, the pantheon of the gods of Greeks. We do the Greeks, right? So we know the Greeks. The Egyptians also had a pantheon. The pantheon of the Egyptians. You know some of those, and we've talked about, like Osiris, right? That guy missing parts. So there is a pantheon of the Egyptian gods also. Something caused Tutankhamun to go from a pantheon of gods to one god. Anybody want to guess what might have caused that little incident?
The plagues
Well, remember the plagues, and I've talked about plagues before. Torah is not necessarily about plagues, although the Torah has the historical accounts of the plagues. Does anyone know what the plagues were, specifically? Yeah, that's exactly correct. I mean, so I know I did ask it in a way that you could have said, well, it was about, this and that and the other thing, but it was specifically each of the gods of the pantheon of Egypt were attacked in each of the plagues. So what potentially caused Tutankhamun to reject the pantheon of the gods and go to a single god that he basically enforced in Egypt for one generation? Then he died, and then it kind of gradually went back to multiple gods. The reason a lot of historians think is because of the exodus from Egypt. Now, there are a lot of people that totally ignore that and say, oh, it just happened. religious systems because it just happens, right? I mean, that's crazy. That's crazy talk. But it's very interesting that they went to a god, Atencommon. Atencommon went to a god, the Aton god. They call him the Aton god, which is very interesting. They're antecedents to do with Jehovah. And next week, or the week after next class, we will talk about the names of God. Adonai kind of sounds like Aton, doesn't it? Just because he's here. Anyway, so the important thing to note is if it's Atencommon, it's probably before 1400, 1431 or so, 1400 BC. We put the date about 1500 BC, which is really good. You notice how many years are separated between 1500 and 432 BC? Is that a significant amount of time? Do people change? Do things change? Do cultures change? Do societies change? Does the food you eat change? We went in a decade, we went from not texting to texting. We went from having, in the 90s, no phones in your pockets to phones in your pockets. In 1,000 years, they went from beating on sticks to having actual stones and metal. I mean, we're talking Bronze Age, Iron Age here, right? Huge changes. As a matter of fact, just huge changes. Huge changes. Money, Lydia, 600 BC. Look, it's in there, right? It went from no money to money, from markets, from trading markets to capitalistic markets. Huge changes in historical things. So, we're talking about a set of documents, the Old Testament documents, the Tanakh, right? The Tanakh, going from 1500 BC to 432 BC. We're talking about the Torah documents, all the Torah documents being about 1500 BC. So with that, that's kind of like what it would call we have the introduction to the different books and pieces parts. But the most important question you should ask, the most important question any historian should ask, and we're historians today, right, is what? Veracity. Can you trust it, right? That's what everybody wants to know. Can you trust it? If your kids don't answer the question, I'll tell you a secret. They want to know. Can I trust it? What do they hear? Well, they're at school. It's a myth. It's made up. It's not true. Creation. God is dead, right? Big Bang kind of proves there's God. But God is dead, right? God is nothing. Don't worry about it. Took God out of schools in 1962. It's really improved society, hasn't it? What do they tell you in college? Your chance of meeting a Christian professor in college, you'll probably meet a Christian professor more easily in hell than you will on a college campus. Although there are, okay. Well, that was Hillsdale. Hillsdale thing. I sent a daughter to Hillsdale. I recommend Hillsdale College. It's a great college because in most colleges, if you stand up and say, I'm a Christian, they'll say, you're a bigot and you're a right-wing evangelistic whatever, right? And you're a terrible person. You say people are going to hell. They don't like it. So most of the time, if you are a Christian and on a college campus, you keep your mouth shut because you could be persecuted for it. So anyway, I'm going to give you facts. These are historical facts. That's all they are. We're going to talk about the Old Testament just like a professor is supposed to talk about every other document. You won't get this from most professors because most of them won't talk about these documents. If they do, this is the way they'll talk about them, but they won't usually. So this is, like I said, another part of a different class. How do we prove history? You ever ask yourself that question? How do you know? How do you prove history? How do you know that something really happened? What's the proof? Now, I could go back, and I will go back. I'll remind you. Maybe I should talk about it more. We will get into it. But the Greeks taught us, the Greeks invented 3 ways to know truth. three ways to know truth. There's the scientific method, the legal historical method, and logic. The scientific method, well, the first one that was invented, which one was the first one that was invented? Herodotus invented it. Herodotus and Theodocles, and this other guy, Theodocles, they invented this method, and Herodotus and Theodocles invented the method, the legal historical method. They invented the legal historical method. That is the method to prove things that are unique and historical. They also use that method, and I'll get into it, to prove that you committed a crime in court. So when you go into the legal profession, the whole point of the legal profession is to teach you the legal historical method. The legal historical method, think about a court of law, and we'll talk about the details of it. The scientific method is used to prove repeatable events. Only repeatable events can be used in the scientific method. Only, got that? Only repeatable events. Can the creation of the earth be proved with the scientific method? Can any historical event be proved with the scientific method? Never. Never. If you know this, then you have won. The other one, logic and reason, is really mathematically based stuff. It's really important to know, and if you're a computer programmer, I advise you to know that. But if you're just living your life, you can forego logic and reason as long as you have scientific method and legal historical method.
I don't know, our society doesn't seem to be doing too well without it.
No, well, I agree our society isn't, but if you can't do the legal historical and the scientific method, just forget the reason. It's out, throw it out. You can't do it, right? You can build and design airplanes, but you may not know how to use them properly. Oh, that's happening, isn't it? Pick an event in antiquity. Pick something. Pick somebody in history. Somebody that we know exists. Like, let's pick Lincoln. I like to use Lincoln. Lincoln's a pretty good example. Lincoln. How do you know he lived? I got picked. How do you know there are pictures of him? Ooh. I have witnesses. I have somebody took the picture and on the back wrote, this is a picture of Abraham Lincoln, la, 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 right? But how do I know? What if somebody faked it? Yeah. I have eyewitness accounts. Somebody wrote, I saw Lincoln. We have things he wrote or attributed to him, right? This is called the legal historical method. I have what's called evidence. And so I start gathering that evidence, the evidence of the fact that he existed. And so people gather, that's what historians do. Guess what? No historian ever uses any history books to study history. See what I said? Matter of fact, if anybody says they're a historian and doesn't tell you to read his history book, every historian who's written a history book will tell you to read his history book. I've written fictional historical novels, and I will tell you to read my books. But as a historian, I'm sorry, I'll tell you, I don't use history books to study history. What do I use? I use primary, secondary sources, and if there are no primary and secondary, I go to tertiary sources. We'll talk about that. But for everything in antiquity, everything in history, I don't care if it's Martin Luther or if it's Lincoln or Washington or any person in history, Julius Caesar, Pliny, Jesus Christ, Moses, whoever you want to talk about, you gather the evidence, and you're looking for the evidence and source of evidence. That is basically how we determine between, for example, myth and history. If it's myth, what do I not have? Yeah, I don't have any primary evidence, right? If it's history, what should I expect to find? lots of evidentiary things, right? So, that's where we go. How do you prove history? I mentioned these. I mentioned these on purpose because I want to lead into this, but we've talked about this, so we should know about this, right? The scientific method only used to test repeatable events. Can't be used to prove historical events. Period. Done. Now, I'll just throw out this. I can show scientifically there has to be a Big Bang. Okay? I'm not saying you have to accept that or whatever. I'm saying that I can show scientifically there's a Big Bang. Now that's a historical point. The problem with the Big Bang is there's a lot of problems with Big Bang, but Big Bang is really good for us Christians. Why? It requires a cause. By the way, the reason you use the term telic cause, which is really good, that's Greek. A telic cause to the Greeks is what? Well, that's precisely what it is, but what did they use the word telic cause euphemistically as? Remember, they're not euphemistic, but telic cause is one of their euphemisms. Caused by God. A God, right? The reason they use the term telic cause is because if I say it was caused by God, then the Greeks would say that's a logical infallibility. You can't prove it was a God. It could have been aliens. I mean, it's like, okay, what? Who's that guy? Stephen Hawking? Stephen Hawking thought it was aliens or super intelligent beings or this or that or the other thing, right? But he never would say it was a God. Now, Stephen Hawking would be happy with the telic cause because then he doesn't have to say it was God. However, I'll just throw this out because this is really important. Philosophy proves, since Immanuel Kant, the reason philosophy's really had problems is because Immanuel Kant proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that there cannot be a not God. So because he proved there cannot be a not God, there must be a God. So philosophy, which is logic and reason, proved there must be God. The Big Bang Theory by, scientific method proves there must be God. And we're going to prove, I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt, we have with the New Testament class, there must be Jesus, there must be God. That's the point, right? That's proving veracity. I'm going to tell you right now, we're going to have a little problem with the Old Testament, but we're going to go through all the proof texts just like we did with the New Testament, and just like you would with any other document in history. But the big deal is this. Don't neglect the tools that people give you. You don't have to believe in the Big Bang. You can believe, like we do, in the 7-day creation. You can believe whatever you like, but I'm just saying, if you got the tool, use it. Right? So what are you going to do when you talk to the next college student that tells you, there's no God? What about the Big Bang? What caused the Big Bang? And they say, there's no God. Well, did you ever study in philosophy? Remember Immanuel Kant? Of course, they'll say no, because, look, most kids today taking philosophy, I'm not sure what kind of philosophy they're taking, but it ain't classics. I don't know what they're reading. Dead white guys, well, they're not white, really, but they're dead. The Greeks. Are they dead white guys? I don't know. They're kind of olive skinned. But anyway, if they're dead and they're white, then who believes them? But they could be Oriental, they could be, Immanuel Kant was, anyway. You see what my point is? What are they studying? I don't know. Anyway, we're going to study just like you would. This is college class. This is college class level. That's what we're doing. So we have the legal historical method, which is the evidence witness method. This is what they do to put you in jail. So if you commit a crime, they're going to use this method against you. Yes, sir.
How would you classify, like, time dating? Science?
Oh, yeah. It won't prove history. What it proves is what? Yeah, the time, because there's multiple methods of doing, you're talking about carbon dating. Carbon dating, there's iridium dating, there's, what's the other one? Calcium dating. There are lots of ways of dating stuff, and it's really good scientifically. What I'm using the scientific method is not to prove a historical event, but rather to prove what? That something was there at that time. And the reason that it's based in the scientific method is what? How do I know that? test, I can get, if I get a whole bunch of stuff from a single strata, right, I'm going to presume that everything in that strata is of the same time. And if I do carbon dating, or iridium dating, or calcium dating, I get a standard deviation. I get a time within a standard deviation. So I don't remember the exact numbers. Carbon dating is like, look, it's pretty accurate for not being the time. It's about 500 years, I think. And then calcium dating can get you within 100 years, which is very accurate. But the point being, if I test a bunch of stuff, right, from what I presume to be the correct time period, then I should get the same dating. Now, I don't want to get into huge detail. I'm just telling you the scientific ways that we get there. But I'm not using, what I'm doing is I'm using the scientific method to determine potential decay rates. But the only way I can get those decay rates is because it's repeatable. It doesn't prove historical events. It proves that the time period of the material could be within that scope, right? And that there are errors plus or minus in that, but it's really meaningless to us. Well, it is meaningful to us because we will eventually get there for archaeology, right? So in archaeology, when I find something from the biblical period that is organic or even non-organic, because I think iridium dating, one of them can be used for inorganic materials, right, to determine dates. So if I get something from the biblical era, what does that let me do? Prove what it is. This is good stuff. This is really good stuff. What does it do for us?
What?
It gives us exhibits. Legal historical method. I told you already, if we want to prove something, let's say we want to prove Moses. What do I got to find? Evidence. Evidence. So what is a carbon dating of something that came from, let's say I found a carbon dating of a road from back at 1500 BC, which is not that long ago in the terms of the big picture, right? What does it tell me? What does it give me?
There were people around at that time.
Yeah, it gives me evidence, right? I get evidence. That's what I'm looking for. That's what we're looking for, is evidence. And the more evidence we have, the more, what do we have? Veracity. The more proof we have, the easier it is to prove our points. Because what is our goal? Okay, what's a big goal that we have? Tell the word about Jesus. Evangelism. But what we want to convince them, right? The only way to convince a lot of people is you got to convince them. You got to get them through, science. You got to get them through history. You got to get them through logic and reason. Because if you don't, they're not coming. And guess what? In the schools, we tell the kids, there's no truth. Right? We're looking at the Torah. Have they ever done a veracity study of the Torah in any school that you know of? Matter of fact, in most colleges, they don't do a veracity study of the Torah. We're doing something unique here. Maybe there's one other person in the world that's getting this. Okay? Some of this, well, the information I have from this is expanded from Josh McDowell and from other sources. This is unique because I developed this. And I developed a lot of information that I use for the other teaching in the New Testament. Because Josh's work went so far, my work has gone even further. So we are looking at the evidences of veracity for the Torah and for the Old Testament. And when I say Old Testament, Tanakh, the Tanakh, Nevi'im, Netivim, and Kedivim. Okay? So all the stuff we talked about. With that, we have three ways, okay, Okay, are we going to use the scientific method? No. Now, we can use logic and reason. That's always, you're allowed. You're allowed to use logic and reason. Okay, please do. I approve of it. But math ain't going to help us a whole lot, but logic and reason can. The big deal is we are going to focus on history, historical legal, because our argument is what? The Torah is what kind of document? It's historical, right? Now, in historical documents, you can have literature, or you can have history, or you can have both together. So we're going to argue that it is history, and they are historical documents. So we're going to gather the evidence. How do we judge the accuracy of written historical evidence? I'm not going to, well, I'll define a little bit. We use 3 criteria to judge that accuracy. One is called the bibliographical. Bibliographical has nothing to do with Bible. Biblios, right? Biblios means a compendium or books. So bibliographical means written evidence. It's written evidentiary. This is the first step. So your professors in college, whenever they taught you history, the first thing they should have done is they should have presented the bibliographical information proof text for any historical document they taught. That's what I do in all my classes. That's why every class I bore you with historical veracity. The second test is internal. If you read the document and it internally is contradictory, internally doesn't fit, doesn't match internally, what do you conclude?
Not a good source.
It's not a good source. Go it, right? Like a bad history book. Like a bad novel, right? You read a bad novel, this is probably a good example. Some of the Aesop's fables. Remember I told you, all the Aesop's fables are cohesive. The morals are wrong. Why? They were having the Romans. The Romans didn't fully understand the Greek, plus they didn't like the morals. They didn't like the conclusions, the telos that they got. So they made up their own. They don't match. And so if I were to read an Aesop's fable, I'd find internal problems because if I read the Latin versions, they would have the morals attached, and I would go, they don't match the Greek ones. Right? So what does that immediately show you? If you didn't know already, that shows you there's a problem because they were translated into Latin, and the Romans added the morals. Bingo, bango, bongo. I hope that when you were a child and you read the Aesop's Fables, well, I guarantee you did not read the unexpurgated Aesop's Fables. Because if you did, it's like reading the Boccaccio. So you would probably get in trouble and they'd kick you out of school today for having pornography. But if you did, you would have noticed that many of the morals don't match what the logos to telos is of the Aesop's Fable. Especially the more rowdy ones, let's say. So, in any case, internal tests. External tests. Any guess? What is the external test?
Other sources confirm.
Other sources. Yes. Other sources, archaeology, photography. Oops, no photography this time. Art. Archaeology, art, right? If I have we do. We have a portrait, a bust of Plato, or of Socrates. We're not sure if it really is Socrates, but it's been handed down to us that it was. Again, evidence, right? I gather evidence. There are some descriptions of Jesus. They're in the Archco documents. They're really cool. I didn't read them to you. I've read them in some of my classes. There's a description of Paul that I think, not Josephus, who was the guy that, who was the guy that translated the Douay? The Latin, from Greek to Latin. Who was that? Starts with a J. Jerome. Jerome passed down a description of Paul. And I don't have it at hand, but there is a description of Paul talking. He had passed down a document. And we don't know where he got the document, but he had quoted it in a text when he was talking to one of the Piuses. Anyway, these 3 tests, if a work passes all 3 tests, the source is considered indisputable, unless it is contradicted by a source of greater degree of merit. Degree or merit. Okay, let's see. What is degree or merit? Degree or merit. Merit refers to how well the work passes the 3 evidentiary tests. Merit is how well it passes bibliographical, internal, and external. So if it passes it really well, it has high merit. The degree is the primacy of witness. We call it primacy of witness. And primacy of source. So, in a court of law, what kind of witness is only allowed in a court of law? Eyewitness. That's called primary or first-hand. What is a secondary witness called in a court of law? Hearsay. Is it allowed? No. However, in history, we allow secondary witnesses. Now, there is a huge argument, which I don't want to go into this argument. There are people, I'm of the opinion that secondary witnesses are very specific. A primary witness has to be an eyewitness. A secondary witness has, in the past, usually been considered like a newspaper or a person taking the record of the primary. So, for example, Mary Todd Lincoln is what kind of witness to her husband's death? Lincoln's death. She saw it. She was right there. She's a primary witness. When she walked out, if there was a reporter that got her information and quoted her, that is a secondary witness. A tertiary is basically a non-witness. A tertiary is, a history book is tertiary, right? What do we put in history books? We put quotes from eyewitnesses. We put quotes or newspaper reports, right? In a history book about Lincoln, what should you see? You should see quotes from eyewitness sources of people who saw Lincoln, or text, evidence, right? Letters he wrote, his signature, things like that, right? That is evidentiary witness. His draft of the 20 years ago, right? Or whatever it is, okay? His draft of that, of Gettysburg Address, is a piece of evidence. You would put that as an evidence. You would also include newspaper reports, right? You put that in your book. Would you include tertiary?
People do all the time.
People do all the time, it's true. The reason we might include tertiary, especially in antiquity, is because, anybody read Pliny's Lives? Pliny was no eyewitness. Well, anybody read Josephus? Okay, yeah, I read all of Josephus. I read it forward and backward, okay? What's the problem with Josephus? Did Josephus ever see anything he wrote about? No. He may have gotten some primary or secondary sources. Guess what every class in the world that teaches about the first century uses? Josephus. Well, why don't you use the New Testament? Holy smoke. Why would we do that? Right? Anyway, there's also none. And the reason this becomes important is, in a historical document, if I have a historical document, the historical document says, I'm writing history, like Herodotus does, right? Or how about Luke? Remember what Luke says? Luke says, I have taken the time to make an account. I have interviewed witnesses, primary witnesses, to the events. And I am writing a history. Herodotus said the same thing. As a matter of fact, almost verbatim, he said the same thing. Old Luke had read Herodotus. So old Luke was copying the legal historical method. This is the way it works. And so if I have a document that says I am writing, for example, a history based on evidence, that's history. On the other hand, if I have a document like the Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Anybody know what the Egyptian Book of the Dead is? Well, incantations to be used when you're dead. They don't work when you're alive. Matter of fact, that's the reason they don't work. You know, if you did them, right? You'd say, priest, I tried the incantation and it didn't work. And he looked and he said, were you dead? Because for the incantations in the Book of the Dead to work, you had to be dead. Does it claim to be history? No. Now, is there history in it? The history we could get out of it is maybe culturally or socially what people kind of thought about stuff. But you know what? You're going to be digging pretty deep. It's like you can find more history in Oliver Twist, right? I'm just saying. You might find more history in a science fiction book. But the big deal is, if the book is an opinion, like for example, all those opinion pieces you read in the paper today, it's called fake news, and I guarantee you they're mostly fake news. They're opinion pieces. Are they history? No, they're not even secondary witness, right? You see people making up stuff all the time. You go, well, that's interesting, right? And I see it on the front page of the paper half the time. You go, what? What's wrong with you people, right? This is how we not only judge documents in antiquity, is how we judge current events. Yes. You can take this, so this is a takeaway, a free takeaway. You don't have to use this for just historical documents. You can use this in your day-to-day life. So, with that, here we go. First of all, the bibliographical tests. Number one, we examine how the document was transmitted in time. That's the bibliographical test. We examine how the document was transmitted to us in time. Why do I say document? Why am I focusing on documents? That's the bulk of what we have. If we have archaeological evidence, that's cool. But guess what? Archaeological evidence doesn't tell us a lot. You find a statue, unless it has an inscription on it, what good does it do you? You're like, well, who is this? I don't know. It was Johnny's sister. Who's Johnny? I don't know. Johnny Anifis. Who's that? I don't know. I'm just saying. Without documents, that is written documents, are there videotapes, audio tapes, pictures, maybe drawings? That's the point. The reason I use the term document is because most of the stuff we get that we know history by, because the Greeks invented the legal historical method. What did the Greeks use to write down history? Documents, right? Writing is what you use. They didn't have videotapes. They didn't have audio tapes. They didn't have, even the hieroglyphics, right, are maybe a picture book. You got pictures with hieroglyphics. So you get a kid's book. That's cool, right? But you have to have the hieroglyphics to tell you what's in the picture. Exactly. So, number one, we examine the number of manuscripts. Number two, we evaluate the time between the original and the earliest manuscript we have. This is an important truth, my friends. There are no originals from any work in antiquity. You hear what I said? There are no originals. None. Period. Stop. There are no originals of the Torah. There are no originals of any document in antiquity. There are no originals of any New Testament documents. Maybe someday we might find one. How would we know?
Moses threw the first original document down at the Israelites.
We'll get to that, yes. That'll be eventually a part of our study, because we got to get to that, right? Yeah, and it was on stone, so it would have been pretty, The reason that these documents don't exist is because they rot. Yeah, they decay.
And they destroyed them, and they destroyed them after they copied them. That was part of the deal.
We'll get to that. That is a very important concept that we will eventually get to, especially about the Torah. So we're moving into that, but keep those things in mind, okay?
So how would we know if things purported to be an original letter of Moses?
We would use the dating methods of the scientific method, carbon. See, this is why you're really irritated about Christians saying, oh, you can't trust carbon dating. You can't trust this dating method. I'm a scientist. Bubba, if I can't trust that, I can't build airplanes. You've got to trust it, and guess what? It does more to help us prove our points than it does help anyone else to disprove our points. If I get a document, right? Remember the scroll of the. This is a perfect example. Remember the Turin, the Shroud of Turin, right? The Shroud of Turin. The church allowed them to make, scientific investigations of the Shroud of Turin. And that's how we know it's not biblically dated, right? the stuff on it, the paint on it, it was painted. It's a pretty cool, neat thing, but it's not from the time of Christ, right? So how do you know? You know because of carbon dating and because of calcium dating, and you can do this stuff. I'm telling you, don't neglect science. Science proves what we want to prove to the world, right? And I'm going to try to give you more and more evidence that allows you to do that. Because my goal is so that we can promote the gospel of Jesus Christ as absolute truth, which I know it is. I love to tell the story, right? We sang the song. To me, it's true. Yes, sir, you have a question?
Well, carbon dating also says the Earth is 10 million years old.
No, carbon doesn't. Carbon can't. Because carbon dating is only for organic materials, and it's C14 versus C12. Now, C14 is radioactive, C12 is not. And so when you eat, you accumulate C14, so it can't be inorganic. It can only be organic. But see, you're looking at the wrong way. You're saying it proves this. Well, I don't care. What it really, it doesn't prove that. And see, you've been, someone has gotten in your mind because you're brainwashed to believe that carbon dating can tell the Earth is 10 million years old. There is no carbon 10 million years old. It can't happen. First of all, they think the Earth, scientists think the Earth is 4.2 billion years old. 4.2 billion years old, by the way. The universe hasn't been around long enough. I've got a great book called Show Me God. And if you want to confound the leftists, read Show Me God and use all the good stuff in there. But like I said, the Big Bang Theory, just ask them, what caused the Big Bang? And they'll say, if they're Stephen Hawking, they'll say, it was a super intelligent being. Well, Shazam, what's that? Sounds like God to me, right? Yes, sir.
I think that the 4.2 billion year estimate for the age of the Earth was that they took the theory of evolution and had to start back timing it to make it valid.
Now, what they've done is they've taken rocks, and this is a problem. This is getting really complicated. I really don't want to get too much in this. As a scientist, I know a lot about this because I've studied this quite a lot. But, our geo guy, if we had Frank in here, Frank's our geo expert. He can tell you precisely. But there are methods. You use methods of decay, not carbon, but of radioactive decay to be able to try to estimate times. So you get, plus or minus a billion years, right? And the only way you can calibrate this stuff is you got to get rocks from outer space. Well, how do you know, right? I mean, I can do stuff pretty easily on Earth because of alluvial data, but it's really hard to get it from outer space. Where did it come from, right? So I'm just saying, use what you got, right? You got all kinds of good data, so find the data and use it. That's what Show Me God's about. Show Me God's by Fred Herring. It's an amazingly good book that will help convince anybody who's a scientist about God. Show Me God, Fred Herring, I believe. Fred Herring. Herring is. No, he's a journalist, but he interviewed. He did witness primary secretary. Anyway, so we examined how the document was transferred to us in time. Number of manuscripts at the time between the original and the earliest manuscript. Like I said, no originals in the manuscripts. The reason is because they're all copied by hand. No Xeroxes, no printers. They had to be copied by hand. So even if you made one, what's the problem? Let's say I write a letter to Dave. Well, that letter, he keeps it, right? And maybe his family keeps it because it's really worth something because of papyrus or whatever. And then eventually it gets what? Rotty. It gets wet. Burned. Or you got a flood. Oh, yuck. What do you do when a book gets flooded in your basement? Yeah, you don't keep them, right? You don't fan them out. Well, they would probably because that's all they got. But what did you have to do to make it better? You had to copy it by hand. So that's the big deal. So all these documents are hand copied. A work with more existing manuscripts is judged to be more accurate. So let's look at the number of manuscripts. Here we go. And I gave you charted of this. These are New Testament era. So here's Catullus, Pliny the Younger, Plato, Euripides, Caesar. Some of this is history, some is not. Aristotle, Sophocles, the New Testament. You've seen this before. I think this is important. Number of copies. Catullus is pretty good. We've got 3 copies. In most documents in antiquity, how many copies do we have? 1. 1 document. Pliny, we got 3. We got 7. Or Catullus, we got 3. Pliny the Younger, 7. 7. You're 9, 10, 49. Aristotle's getting pretty good. Sophocles, 193. The New Testament, we have 24,633 copies. Here are the really early copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Wow. You know, as I've shown you before, New Testament's really easy. New Testament is great because I got lots of copies and three. Yep. Here's ancient manuscripts. Ancient manuscripts. So I've picked the Old Testament Dead Sea Scrolls, the Old Testament Masoretic, and we'll talk about this, the Old Testament Septuagint, Catullus, Pliny, Plato, same comparison. Here's where my problems begin. Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest evidence we have of the Torah and the Tanakh. There are 16 fragments. When it says fragments, okay, these are pretty big fragments. I've got 2 copies of Isaiah. When they say fragments, okay, of the Tanakh or the Torah, remember, the Tanakh is a set of scrolls, right? The Torah is the first 5. It's always found together. I have 16 fragments, which means basically I have about 16 books, most of them. But that's the oldest I got. Of the Masoretic, unfortunately the Masoretic, look when they're written. Look at the earliest copies of the Masoretic documents. The Masoretic documents, and I'll get to that, were written about 600 to 900 AD. I've got about 4,000 copies of Masoretic documents. Remember what I told you about Masoretic documents? And I read them in a synagogue? Nope. They got pointlets. I stuffed my stuff with Old Testament junk. So this is Holy Scriptures according to the Masoretic text, right here. This is an English translation, not the NIV. But the Masoretic, this would be illegal to be read in a synagogue, even if it weren't in English, because it has Masoretic pointlets. The Masoretes added the pointlets. This stuff is past antiquity. These are not documents in antiquity. But I have a lot of them, which is really cool. This is Old Testament interlinear, and this has pointlets. Illegal to read, but it's really cool. But it's an interlinear, like the interlinear Greek, but it's Hebrew. So that's Hebrew. It's Masoretic Hebrew. Anyway, so I have 16 fragments, about 4,000 copies of Masoretic. Now here's probably the best we got. We got the Septuagint. Septuagint was written in 250 BC. But 250 BC, look at my problem. The originals were written in 1500, especially the Torah. 250 is pretty good for Malachi, right? Not so good for Torah, other Tanakh documents. Pretty good for Ezekiel and Ezekiel and Nehemiah. Not so good for the early stuff. I got 327 Old Testament Septuagints. That's pretty good stuff. It still looks pretty good compared to the New Testament. No, and here's the picture. Here's the one I gave you. Greater is better. We got the New Testament. The Masoretic's pretty good. The Old Dead Sea Scrolls. You see what my problem is, right? This is a problem for us. We can overcome it. The Iliad is the best next to the New Testament. The problem with the Iliad is, well, not only is it a myth, it is a declared myth. Okay? Remember I told you, when we see Herodotus, we see Theodocles, in their documents, like Luke, they say this is a history. The Iliad does not say this is a history of the Trojan War. It basically tells us it's a myth about gods and about man. how you like. But according to the Greeks themselves, the Iliad is a poetry about mythic events in the history of the Greeks. But it's the next best New Testament. Almost certain we have the complete text. And this is the problem, right? The reason I want more documents so that I know that they confirm each other. Okay, I'm going to tell you something. Did you know there are differences between the New Testament documents and each other? That's why we have to go with what's called the majority text. The majority text is a compendium of the best sources we have that is the best Greek we have. You think we have the same problem with the Old Testament? Yeah, we do. In fact, we have it in spades. So for the New Testament, I'm 38 times 2 magazines more certain I have the complete text of the New Testament, because I have lots of copies. The Old Testament documents present us a bibliographical problem. There's not enough ancient manuscripts. Manuscripts that exist are fragments. This basically puts the Old Testament on the same level. This isn't a bad story. This means that all that stuff that Caesar and Sophocles and Aristotle wrote, what is the Old Testament equal to? They're equal to them. You see my point? I mean, okay, you were going along thinking, I'm giving you a soft story. No! I'm telling you it's the same. Didn't your professors in college tell you that? They should have. They should have told you that the bibliographical test, that the Old Testament, the Tanakh, and the Torah is the exact same as all those ancient manuscripts in antiquity. That's what they should have told you. Let's look at the span of time. The less the time interval between when the original and the earliest existing manuscript, the more accurate the work is considered. Okay, you see what that is, right? The time between when the document was written and the first copy. So I got Septuagint at 250. Dead Sea Scrolls are not much younger than that, right? So the span of time between when it was written and the earliest document I have. Yes, sir.
You said when it was written. Wouldn't that be when it occurred, 1500? It was oral for a long time.
Don't say that. If you say oral, you just destroyed the Old Testament. If you want to claim it was oral, you just destroyed the Old Testament. The Old Testament cannot be oral. If it's oral, you got a serious problem. Why? Why is there a problem if it's oral? Exactly. It's like the Iliad. If you say it's oral, it's something like the Iliad. The Iliad was oral. So the Iliad is an oral source, is myth.
I guess where I was going with that, in the New Testament documents, you said this is when it occurred, how soon before it was written down. And in the case of the Old Testament, it occurred starting 1500, how soon before it was actually written down?
Well, we will get to that, but that is a problem. Let's say, we can do it two ways. Let's say the earth, don't attack me on this, okay? But let's say the earth is 4 billion years old, okay? 4.2 billion, right? Let's just say it. Don't get me on this. The 7-day creation idea is it's 5,000 years old. 5,000 to 1,500, any eyewitnesses? Methuselah's dead, guys. I have no eyewitnesses. What's my problem? Remember, we got merit and primacy. The thing you got to do, okay, I'm giving you advice, okay? The thing you got to do when you get a fight, if you get in a fight with scholarship about the Old Testament, you can't go much beyond 22, I think it's Exodus 22, chapter 22. Why?
Because of all that,
You don't have an eyewitness. If you call it oral, you got an even worse problem. But we'll get to that because it's who was recording the evidence, right? You have an argument. There is an argument if you argue that, for example, Moses was given an inspiration or Moses was given the words by God, right? You still have a problem because what are they going to say? Well, there's no God.
He just wrote down whatever.
Yeah, he wrote down whatever. Why is it different than Zoroastrianism or Buddhism or Bhagavad Gita? Or anything. Take your pick. Why is it any better than any of these other documents, right? You don't have an argument. I'm sorry, you don't. You must say, the only hope you have is you've got to say, well, but I have primary source and secondary source evidence from at least 22, Genesis 22 on, right? The other part you say, you tell them, well, you can take it however you want. Literature, myth, I don't care. Because the point is, what do you want them to do? You want to stay engaged. And remember, when we talked about Hebrews, what did they tell the Hebrews? Keep them engaged, right? I'm just telling you, I will show you how you do have standing in some of this stuff, okay? But I'm just telling you, it's difficult. And it's not because, matter of fact, if we're measuring it to other comparative documents in the antiquity, we're still up. But it just becomes difficult. And you have to acknowledge it, because if you acknowledge it, what happens? It takes their argument away, right? If you fight them and say, well, it's inspired and I believe it, you should too, it takes faith, what happens?
They'll tune you out.
You're done. That's it. You just forget it. Forget it. It's not going. Because they'll say, well, the Bhagavad Gita is too. And they're standing on that. And I'll show you. We'll do a comparison. Well, here, let's look at this comparison. We want to go through this at least here. So here's ancient manuscripts. Catalysts. You notice all these are at least 1,000 years. The best we have is Plenty Younger History, 750. The New Testament's about 80 years. So we're talking magnitudes. Now, of course, what we are studying is instead, here's ancient manuscripts. Here's the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we're talking 1350 years. For the Masoretic, we're talking about 24,000 years, 2,100 years. The Old Testament were 600. That's pretty good. Septuagint's pretty good, but it's Greek. All the others, to New Testament. So,
What about epic and Gilgamesh?
I will show you. I've got that in here. That's next thing here. So here, the less is better. So here's New Testament, way low, right? 80. And here's the others. What does that mean? It means for the bibliographical span test that basically in this bibliographical test, the Old Testament documents face bibliographical obstacles. It's very similar to other historical documents. It's the same footing as other historical documents. Like I said, this is not a bad story. This is a good story. It means it's equal to. So if somebody says, well, why do you believe in the Old Testament? You'd go, well, why do you believe in Caesar? Why do you believe in Herodotus? What's wrong with you? Right? Now, it's uncommon to compare documents that claim historical veracity to those that don't, and this is one of the pictures I want to give you next, because we have more to go on this, but here's what you're asking for right here. Egyptian Book of the Dead, Zoroastrianism, Shintoism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Confucianism, Taoism, Islam, Sikhism, Baha'i, Mormonism. I think that's all, unless somebody's got one to add. Here is your stuff. So, I got 16 fragments, 43 of the Book of the Dead. I've got 9 copies. They're all different. Zoroastrianism, I got 4 copies. They're wacky. They do claim to be history, but it's a history from the beginning of the world. And the problem is there's no eyewitness. Has anyone ever read the Zoroastrianist documents? They're wacky. In other classes, I have quotes. They're really strange. Shintoism claims to be historical, but it's modern. It's modern. Hinduism, there are many variant. Buddhism, many variant. Jainism, many variant. In other words, there's none these are, look at this, some of these claim to be history, but there is no singular history of the Buddhists, of Buddha. In fact, the earliest Buddhist document was written way after Buddha was dead. Confucianism, we got a few fragments because they were destroyed by one of the kings. Yeah. You got Taoism, you got 1. Islam is modern. Islam, in fact, Islam is one of the keys to antiquity. 600 AD is past antiquity. The reason is because we do have copies of the Quran that are originals. You know that? That's where antiquity is divided, about 600 AD. Sikhism, modern. Baha'i is modern. Mormonism, Mormonism has real issues. There's none, and it's, you know, we can talk about that. But we can go over this a little bit next week. That's why I said I want to stretch this into 2 classes. I also want to give you more information that you can take home with you. So I've got this if anybody wants any of this information, but this is basically the stuff. Thank you, Father, for your